April 15, 1912. The Titanic had already slipped beneath the surface of the North Atlantic. The lights were gone, the music had stopped, and the world believed the story was over. But what most people don't realize is that the most haunting part of the disaster didn't happen while the ship was sinking. It happened after it was gone. In the freezing darkness, hundreds of people were still alive in the water, fighting, breathing, hoping. And for a brief moment in time, rescue was still possible. The final moments before the sinking. In the final minutes before the Titanic disappeared, the atmosphere on board had completely changed. What started as confusion had turned into desperation. The ship was no longer just listing. It was breaking apart under immense pressure, its structure slowly giving way to the forces of the ocean. The angle of the deck became steeper, making it harder for passengers to even stand, let alone move with any sense of control. People who had once believed the ship was unsinkable were now facing a reality they could not escape. Panic spread unevenly. Some rushed toward the remaining lifeboats, pushing through the crowd while others stood frozen in disbelief, unable to process what was happening. Families were separated in the chaos. Final goodbyes were exchanged in moments that felt unreal. The band continued to play, not because they thought it would save anyone, but because it brought a strange sense of calm to an uncontrollable situation. Officers attempted to maintain order, but their authority was fading as the situation worsened. The cold air, the rising water, and the growing awareness that there weren't enough lifeboats created a tension that no one on board could fully comprehend. When the ship finally split and began its final descent, hundreds of people were still on board, and within seconds they would be thrown into the freezing darkness of the Atlantic. The shock of entering the water. When the Titanic sank, more than 1,500 people were suddenly thrown into the freezing Atlantic Ocean. The temperature of the water was around -2 degrees Celsius, a level so cold that survival becomes almost impossible. The moment a human body enters water that cold, the reaction is immediate and overwhelming. It's known as cold shock, and it affects the body in ways that are almost impossible to control. Breathing becomes rapid and erratic. The body gasps involuntarily, often causing people to inhale water instead of air. Heart rate spikes and panic sets in almost instantly. For many passengers, especially those who were not strong swimmers or were already exhausted, this initial shock would have been enough to overwhelm them. But for those who managed to stay afloat, the situation only became more difficult. The body loses heat at an extreme rate in freezing water. Within minutes, muscles begin to fail. Hands lose grip strength. Legs become weak and unresponsive. Even simple movements like keeping your head above water require more energy than the body can sustain. What makes this even more tragic is that many of these individuals were conscious during this time. They were aware of what was happening, aware of the cold, and aware of the danger. They were fighting against a force that could not be overcome. And in that moment, survival wasn't about determination. It was about how long the body could resist the inevitable. The voices in the darkness. For those who made it into lifeboats, what happened after the sinking became the most haunting part of the entire disaster. As the Titanic disappeared beneath the surface, the ocean was suddenly filled with sound, hundreds of voices echoing across the water. People were crying out for help, calling the names of loved ones, shouting into the darkness in a desperate attempt to be heard. Survivors later described it as overwhelming, a sound so intense and emotional that it left a permanent mark on their memory. It wasn't just noise. It was fear, pain, and desperation all at once. At first, the cries were loud and chaotic, overlapping and continuous. But as time passed, something changed. The voices began to weaken. The number of calls started to decrease. What had been a roar of human sound slowly turned into scattered voices. Then those voices became fewer and fewer, until eventually there was silence. That silence was not peaceful. It was heavy. It carried the weight of what had just happened. And for those who heard it, it became one of the most unforgettable moments of their lives. Why most lifeboats didn't turn back. One of the most debated aspects of the Titanic disaster is the decision made by most lifeboats not to return for survivors in the water. Many of these boats were not filled to capacity. Some had enough space to take on additional passengers, yet they remained at a distance. The reason for this decision was fear. Those in the lifeboats believed that if they returned, they would be overwhelmed by the number of people in the water. They imagined dozens of desperate individuals trying to climb aboard at the same time, potentially causing the boat to capsize and putting everyone at risk. This fear was not entirely irrational. In a situation where survival instincts take over, people act unpredictably. The passengers in the lifeboats were already in a fragile state, physically and emotionally. The idea of turning back into chaos felt like stepping back into danger, so they stayed away. They listened to the cries, knowing that people were still alive, but chose not to risk their own survival. From a modern perspective, it's easy to question this decision. But in that moment, surrounded by darkness, cold, and uncertainty, it felt like the only choice they could make.
You don't understand. If we go back, they'll swamp the boat. They'll pull us right down, I'm telling you.
The small window of survival. What many people don't fully understand is that there was a brief window of time where rescue could have made a significant difference. A small and fragile gap between survival and loss that existed for only a matter of minutes. It wasn't a long opportunity, and it certainly wasn't guaranteed. But it was real, and within that short span, decisions mattered more than anything else. Not everyone in the water died immediately. Some passengers managed to stay afloat for several minutes, and in rare cases, even longer. They held onto pieces of debris, used fragments of the ship for support, or simply struggled to keep themselves above the surface, using whatever strength they had left. Some may have formed small clusters, trying to stay together, while others drifted alone in the darkness, disoriented but still alive. This created a narrow window, perhaps 10 to 20 minutes, where intervention could have saved lives. It wasn't enough time for a full rescue operation, but it was enough for lifeboats nearby to turn back and reach at least some of those still fighting to survive. Even a small delay in action, even a few minutes, meant the difference between reaching someone alive or finding them too late. During this time, the people in the water were still conscious. They were still capable of responding. They could see the distant outlines of lifeboats. They could hear voices. They could call out. There was still awareness, still hope, still a belief, however faint, that rescue might come. And that hope is what makes this moment so powerful and so tragic at the same time. If more lifeboats had turned back quickly, it's likely that additional survivors could have been rescued. Not hundreds, but possibly dozens. Enough to make a meaningful difference. Enough to change the final numbers. Enough to alter the way we remember that night, even if only slightly. But that window closed rapidly. As the cold took its toll, the number of survivors decreased. Strength faded. Movements became slower and weaker. Voices grew quieter. The energy required just to stay afloat became too much for the body to sustain. One by one, people lost the ability to keep themselves above water. And with that, the chance of rescue slipped away. Eventually, the opportunity for survival disappeared completely. What had been a scene filled with movement and sound turned into stillness. The ocean, which had been alive with voices just moments earlier, became silent again. By the time most lifeboats could have returned safely, it was already too late. The moment had passed. The chance was gone, and what remained was not just the loss of life, but the knowledge that for a short time, survival had been within reach. Lifeboat 14, the only real rescue attempt. Out of all the lifeboats launched that night, only one made a serious effort to return and search for survivors. Lifeboat 14, led by 5th Officer Harold Lowe, stands out as the only organized rescue attempt after the sinking. Lowe understood something that many others didn't in that moment. Time was everything. He knew that if anyone was still alive in the water, they wouldn't be for long. But even with that understanding, the situation was complicated. His lifeboat was already filled with passengers, and turning back immediately without preparation could have created chaos or even danger for those already on board. So instead of rushing back instantly, Lowe made a calculated decision. He gathered nearby lifeboats and began redistributing passengers, creating space in his own boat for potential survivors. This process took time, valuable time that those in the water could not afford to lose. Once the boat was finally light enough, he turned back toward the site of the sinking. The men rowing with him knew what they were heading into, and the silence between them spoke louder than words. They were not returning to a scene of rescue. They were returning to a scene of aftermath. The few who were found alive. When Lifeboat 14 finally reached the area where the Titanic had sunk, the reality was devastating. The ocean was no longer filled with cries or movement. Instead, it was covered with bodies, floating still and silent under the dim light of the night sky. But among them, there were a few who were still alive. Historical accounts suggest that only around 4 to 6 individuals were rescued from the water alive. These people had survived longer than expected, holding on in conditions that were almost impossible to endure. Some had managed to keep part of their bodies out of the water by clinging to wreckage. Others had simply endured through sheer chance and resilience. Even then, survival was uncertain. Many of those rescued were barely conscious. Their bodies were stiff, their breathing shallow, and their condition critical. Some were unable to speak. Others were too weak to move. And despite being pulled from the water, not all of them made it. Some died shortly after rescue, as the damage caused by the cold was already too severe. It was a rescue, but only just. Why survival was so rare? The reason so few people survived in the water comes down to the extreme conditions of that night. Cold water is unforgiving. It doesn't give the body time to adapt. It doesn't allow for recovery. Once you are exposed to temperatures that low, the countdown begins immediately. The human body relies on maintaining its internal temperature to function. When that temperature drops, systems begin to fail. Muscles lose coordination. Breathing becomes irregular. Consciousness fades. In water near freezing, this process happens rapidly. It's not a matter of hours, it's a matter of minutes. Even the strongest individuals would not have lasted long under those conditions. What makes this even more tragic is that many people likely survived the initial entry into the water. They were alive. They were conscious. They were trying to stay afloat. But the environment gave them no chance to hold on. Survival wasn't about effort or determination. It was about how long the body could resist the inevitable, and for most, that time was very short. The emotional weight of survival. For those who survived the disaster, the physical experience was only part of the story. The emotional impact stayed with them for the rest of their lives, shaping the way they remembered that night and, in many cases, the way they lived every day afterward. Survival did not bring a sense of closure. Instead, it left behind unanswered questions, lingering images, and a weight that never fully lifted. Many survivors later spoke about the moment after the ship sank, the moment when the cries filled the night. It wasn't just the sound itself, but the feeling behind it. The desperation, the fear, the realization that so many lives were slipping away at once. It wasn't something they could forget. It wasn't something they could move past. It became a permanent part of their memory, replaying in quiet moments in dreams and in reflections years later. Some began to question their own decisions. They wondered if they could have done more, if they had turned back sooner, if they had taken the risk. These weren't easy thoughts to carry. They weren't questions with clear answers, but they stayed, repeating over time, creating a kind of internal conflict that never truly resolved. Survivor guilt became a real and lasting burden. Knowing that others had been so close to safety, yet were lost, created a deep sense of responsibility. It wasn't logical, but it was emotional. The idea that survival could have been shared, that more lives might have been saved, made it difficult to fully accept their own escape. That sense of why them and not others followed many survivors for the rest of their lives. Even years later, interviews and personal accounts revealed the same complex emotion, regret mixed with relief, gratitude for survival, but also pain for those who didn't make it. Many spoke with hesitation, as if revisiting the memory brought them back to that night. Their voices often carried a quiet heaviness, reflecting how deeply the experience had stayed with them. Because survival, in this case, didn't feel like victory. It didn't come with celebration or relief in the way people might expect. Instead, it came with reflection, with questions, and with a lasting emotional weight that never fully disappeared. The truth behind the question. So, was anyone still alive after the Titanic sank? The answer is yes, but only for a very brief and fragile moment, a moment that existed quietly in the darkness after the ship had already disappeared. It wasn't obvious. It wasn't visible from a distance, but for those who were there, it was real. There were people in the water who were still alive after the ship went down. People who were breathing, struggling, and holding on with whatever strength they had left. Some were calling out into the night, hoping someone would hear them. Others were too weak to shout, simply trying to stay afloat for as long as possible. In those first few minutes, there was still life in the water. Still movement, still awareness, still hope. But that moment was incredibly short-lived. The freezing ocean ensured that survival beyond a few minutes was extremely rare. The cold didn't just weaken the body, it took control of it. Muscles stopped responding, breathing became harder to control, and the ability to think clearly began to fade. What started as a fight for survival quickly turned into a struggle the body could not sustain. This changes how we understand the disaster. It wasn't just a story of a ship sinking and lives being lost instantly. It was a story of a narrow window, one where survival was possible, but only for a short time. A moment where people were still alive, still waiting, still hoping that help would come before it was too late. And in that window, decisions mattered. Timing mattered. Action mattered. A few minutes could have made a difference. A single choice, to turn back, to take a risk, to act quickly, could have meant the difference between life and death for at least some of those people. Some were saved. A very small number were pulled from the water, proving that survival, even in those conditions, was not entirely impossible. But many more were lost in that space between sinking and silence. That quiet, haunting moment when the ship was gone, the ocean was still, and the chance for rescue slowly disappeared along with the last voices in the darkness. So the next time you hear the story of the Titanic, remember this. The disaster didn't end when the ship disappeared beneath the ocean. For a brief and terrifying moment, hundreds of people were still alive in the water, surrounded by darkness, fighting against the cold, holding on to whatever hope they had left. Some of them were calling out. Some were trying to stay afloat, and some were simply waiting for help that never came in time. That moment, those few minutes after the sinking, may have been the most critical part of the entire tragedy. Because in that window, survival was still possible. Not for everyone, but for some, and that's what makes it so haunting. The idea that a small difference in timing, a single decision, or a little more courage could have changed the outcome for even a few more lives. But the ocean that night was unforgiving. The cold was absolute, and fear, uncertainty, and darkness shaped the choices that were made. By the time rescue came back, the opportunity had already passed, leaving behind only silence and the weight of what could have been. And maybe that's why this story still resonates today. Not just because of how the Titanic sank, but because of what happened after. Because in those final moments, it wasn't just about a ship going down. It was about human vulnerability, human decisions, and how close some people came to surviving. A few minutes, a few choices, and an entire outcome that could have been different.